Welcome, everybody. I'm Iwei Wong. I'm the co-chair, along with Holman Se, who's over here, from the FSM Educational Program Series. We're from the committee that puts on these programs, so we want to welcome all of you. Tonight is part of UC Berkeley celebration of Constitution Day, so the topic for tonight, I think, is quite appropriate for that. Constitution Day was yesterday, so this is part of that celebration. Just a little plug for the committee first. Out at the table that you saw when you came in, we have some flyers out there. If any of you are UC Berkeley affiliates, especially student groups, we're very interested. We're interested in hearing your proposals for more programs. We're looking for maybe one more program this semester and a couple programs next semester. So please take a look at our call for proposals flyer and come up with a speaker panel. Maybe you'll get some inspiration from tonight's program. A couple of other materials I want to just call your attention to that are also at the table, along with, there's plenty of materials out there if you want to kill some trees. We have a flyer here for a documentary film program that's going to be airing on PBS next month, but first there's going to be a screening over in Oakland, and it's about the Chicago 10, which of course was part of, only a small part, but a significant part of the political and social history of 1968, which is part of the topic tonight. And then finally, I just also want to point out this little flyer, which is about the Great Rehearsal, which is the sort of week-long program of events of which tonight's program is a part. So after that very long introduction, let me introduce Julian Boll, who's from the Doe Library and who's going to introduce our panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Iwe. Welcome everyone to the Archives of Dissent, the first free speech movement program this year. And my name is Julian Boll, and I'm the hands-rousing conservator at UC Berkeley Library in the Preservation Department. I'm just going to introduce everything, and before I hand over to my co-organizer, who's going to moderate, which is not a word I usually use about him, but who's going to moderate this evening's proceedings, it is my pleasure to begin with some brief thanks and introductions. First, I'd like to thank the Free Speech Cafe Program Committee and for the cafe for hosting the event and for sponsoring the Archives of Dissent and all their hard work. I used to be on this committee, so I really know how much effort it is to put all the chairs up and do all the work. And I'd also like to thank the archivists, librarians, curators, book people, collectors, and historians who have asked to come this evening to debate the issues around caring for the radical past and its artifacts, not to mention the future of the Archives of Dissent. Now, I just want to introduce very briefly the presenters who have been asked to prime the debate with some opening remarks. In the red shirt here, t-shirt, we have Julie Herrada, who's the Labadie Collection librarian at the University of Michigan, and she's flown from the Midwest to come here tonight. And Julie is curator of the largest collection of social protest materials in the country, which we'll hear more about this evening. And then there's Lincoln Cushing, who's next to her on her right, and he put up the show that you saw, but he's well known to many, actually, probably in this room, because he is now what we call an independent librarian. He likes to say out of work, but we call it independent. And he did work for many years on the campus here and is very familiar with the range of radical archives in the Bay Area. Lincoln now curates the Docs Populi archive, real and virtual. We thank Lincoln for compiling this evening's exhibit, the rolling montage of images of dissent from the 1960s. And Kalim Smith, who's on his right, is a UC Berkeley doctoral student in anthropology and folklore, researching the preservation of Native American languages threatened with extinction. He will approach the idea of preservation in a very different way that most archivists would do if asked to think of saving a language for posterity. And then finally, but not least, we have Megan and Rick, Prelinger, who are co-founders of the Prelinger Library, and those of you who haven't been there, you have to go. It's an appropriation-friendly, image-rich, browsable research collection of 50,000 books, periodicals, printed ephemera, and government documents, located south of Market in San Francisco. And Rick's enormous and famous collection of non-commercial film and images from below is now lodged with the Smithsonian. With that, I now pass the baton, it's okay, I'm British, over to my fellow organizer, Ian Boll.
Just a few words of thanks of my own before we start. Thanks to Jill, my co-organizer, and to the Free Speech Movement Cafe Program Committee, and then also to the organizers, my fellow organizers of the whole week of events that started yesterday, and this is the second event in a packed week under the rubric of The Great Rehearsal, which is the title of an essay written by Immanuel Wallerstein, and it's his daughter Kathy Wallerstein, Andrei Grubacek, Ramzi Kanan, and Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, who formed the committee that's put this remarkable week together. A special shout out to all the conservators, librarians, book fetishists, and crackpot collectors who've assembled here tonight. And actually, there's a serious point behind this, because Ramzi reminded me that much of what has survived, and of course the relics from the past are in many ways arbitrary, much of it depends indeed on fanatical fetishism of a certain kind, one has to say. Because we're not just talking about the big institutions here, but of course about independent and private passions, radical passion that has allowed this material to survive. In my own case, as a historian of the 17th century in Ireland, I mean, the history of Ireland is in many ways a tragedy, not least the Four Courts fire in the early 1920s, in which whatever proportion it was of Irish written history, you know, went up in smoke. We have in the room here the son of one of the most remarkable radical collectors in the world, Håkon Ewan. And his son Eddie is here, and the Ewan collection, which is now, we're pleased to say, within the university here, Ethnic Studies, is a completely unparalleled documentation in many forms of what happened here in the 60s. Gathered according to very clear epistemological and philosophical principles by Håkon Ewan, who gave up a life of the philosophy of science to document what happened here. And Eddie, not just out of an act of filial piety, has made it part of his life's work to make sure that this collection stays intact. It's more or less undocumented, uncatalogued yet. But we hope that will change. The question, of course, of what it costs to do that, particularly for things outside the institutions, is part of the project for this evening. I'm reminded by one of the librarians at Stanford that the Hoover Institution has a plane waiting so that in the bright dawn after a revolution or a counter-revolution, Hoover archivists are on that plane and going to wherever in the world in order to gather the materials for the Hoover Institution for the study of war, peace, and revolution. Makes one think. A word on the logic. We've gathered here a representative of certain of the themes that we we thought would be important to discuss here this evening. Julie Herrada is working within a very large public institution. Lincoln is now an unaffiliated, independent librarian. Kalim is coming at the idea of the Foucauldian archive, or along a very different vector, which would be quite challenging to those of us who think of archives as material deposits. And the Prelingers, of course, are doing this remarkable and unparalleled thing in their library. And I will leave it them to describe it. But in addition to that, it's a real library, but they're taking very seriously the questions and issues raised by the enclosure of the commons, in particularly in an age of Google and the virtual life. So the logic suggests that we will start with a short 10-minute provocations, instigations, beginning with Lincoln, who will talk about the local scene. Julie will then describe her work in this extraordinary collection, the Labadie Collection in Michigan. Then Kalim will address us, and then Rick and Megan will speak. That, of course, is only the beginning. At that point, we will open it up to a much more, a rather unusual, formally rather unusual in this series, a genuine, we hope, dialogue. We have thrown out the KQED-ization of the Free Speech Movement Cafe program, 3x5 cards, questions only, filtered through a gatekeeper. Nevertheless, I am the moderator. I do reserve the right to... No, actually, and those of us who were there, I mean, there are some 68 are in the room, and, you know, there's serious business to do. So, you know, there may be people who will let it be known if someone is going on too long or beside the point. What's happened? Am I being... That's right. Okay, so without further ado, so we'll be opening up to the company after the initial provocations. So without further ado, please welcome our panel. And Lincoln, would you fire off?
Thank you. Hey, thank you, Ian. Thank you, everyone. I used to work on the committee that do these programs too, so I know how much work it is. It's a very worthwhile effort. So these are called a lot of things: archives of dissent, radical archives, social movement archives. What they all really are is an act of political cultural resistance. Some form or another, it's a way of saying the dominant culture has its institutions. We need something that will reflect our voice and the voices of people that have been disenfranchised historically. And so I think all of us that are doing this kind of work do it because it's our form of political work. If you're lucky, it can also be a job. But it's what we do as a passion because there's a giant void there. And as time goes by, that void gets bigger. As history gets larger, there's more of it to document. So we jump into this, and there's several points that I just want to get across here. One is that, you know, history, as it's so vast and deep that even the things that you sort of think you know, it turns out you really sort of don't remember that much. I mean, I went to a conference last year in Canada about the long 60s, which is sort of the shorthand version of 60 through like 72. And scholars from all over the world were talking about the 60s, and people that were there really sort of were remembering what was going on. People were still putting together the pieces, and there's still a huge amount of scholarship to do just on that little period. So the role of archives in helping scholars is crucial. In any given period, having the source materials is essential. And so the work I've been doing has been involved with the relationship between digitization and physical archives. I mean, we're on the cusp of a really significant moment in history in this profession. I mean, three things alone stand out for me as being dramatic changes in how we do the work that we do. One is the existence of databases for searching and storing and retrieving data. One is digital imaging. My field is political posters. Slides were really, really clunky. Digital images are enormously transferable. And then the web itself as a way of sharing information and gathering information. It's a two-way street. Those three things alone are transforming what archives are and how they do it. And so I'm thrilled to be doing this kind of work at this period in history. I work in sort of non-standard documents. I don't work in books. There are a lot of protocols. These have been handled historically for many, many years. People know how to catalog a book. People don't really know how to catalog a poster or a video or an audio clip. It's a transitional field, and as the media changes, new problems come up, but also new possibilities emerge as well. So this is a fantastic period to be doing this kind of work, especially for the rich, wild, wonderful stuff of social movements. So I work with several archives, one of which I inherited just several months ago from a fellow, Michael Rossman, who was an activist in the free speech movement. He began to realize, again, there's a void. He was a science teacher. He wasn't a poster scholar, but he began to realize in the mid-'70s that his small poster collection mattered, and it was a good way of teaching what the '60s were about to other people. So he started to expand that collection. And when he died in May, he had this pretty much the second largest known independent political poster collection in the country, 25,000 single titles. The Center for the Study of Political Graphics in Los Angeles has more, but these are outside of major institutions. Nobody's taking this on because it's an act of political passion. The Bancroft Library, the Hoover Institution, the Smithsonian, they've got bits and pieces. They don't approach it the same way we do it here. So those of us on this side of the table, and many of you, know what it's like. It is an act of craziness to be jumping into this. But it does lend itself to building the understanding and the fabric of history. So I work with the All of Us or None archive, which is now landing in my house in a month. That's Michael Rossman's archive of mostly Bay Area, but broader than that, mostly domestic posters. I worked with an archive of posters from a print shop in Berkeley, Inkworks Press. So there, it wasn't a gathered collection. It was using a point of production as a repository of work. I've worked with virtual collections. I'm doing a book on labor posters where I've traveled around like a honeybee to various archives around the country, shot their posters, and built a virtual collection that's then used for projects. So there's different ways to gather this stuff, and the stuff is virtual as well as physical. Chinese posters, a giant poster collection from the Cultural Revolution landed in my lap. The physical collection is now in the East Asian Library, in the building across the way there, but I shot images of everything, and every single one of those posters is not just in their physical collection, it's online. You can look at every single one on my website. So the web allows the democratization of the medium. So I want to just end with a couple of these issues two of the things that I think are sort of going to be talked about and are pretty controversial within the profession. One is, despite the sort of excitement and sexiness of digital archives, there's still a real need for physical archives. It's expensive to store stuff and keep it climate controlled and catalog it and make it accessible and have staff for it. And so the contradiction between the major institutions that have those resources and the community-based institutions that have the willpower, there's a big continuum between those two. And so where do the physical things land is really a challenge. And the second thing has to do with sort of the issue of public access versus legitimate intellectual property rights. More and more stuff as it gets put online starts to run the risk of being ripped off. And ripped off means various things to different people. But that's also a challenge that we in this profession have to face as we essentially become publishers. We're no longer just having a bunch of stuff in a box and you can come and look at it. As we post it for the public, that trade-off begins to be a little bit more of a challenge as well. So I just want to throw those two things out as being really challenging topics for this profession. But I encourage all of you, no matter, everybody's got something in their house. They've got a few posters rolled up that are bad. It could be the last poster on earth of that particular event. So don't think of them as art, think of them as historical documents, and don't throw anything away without checking an archivist.
Lincoln Cushing. Do go to his Docs Populi. Get it? Docs Populi, DOCS, Docs Populi website. Full of good things. Lincoln, because you came in on time, exemplary as an opening salvo, I've got here some posters for your collection for the upcoming week. And while I'm just before we go to Julie, I want to say that the great rehearsal, all these upcoming events, tonight being the second event, tomorrow on the campus, pretty much all day, organized by Roxanne. Roxanne, can we recognize Roxanne, please? Where is Roxanne?
Yeah.
Oh, she was earlier.
She left.
Oh, she's left. Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz has done a lot of the organizing for tomorrow's event. Go to greatrehearsal.com. No, not .org. Sorry. .org, yes, sorry, silly of me. For details of the entire week. Lincoln.
Thank you, sir.
Julie, over to you. Julie Herrada, please.
I just want to say first that there is a seat up here if anybody wants to sit down. I don't know if there's any other empty seats, but I know some people are in the back and can't see. So there's no more empty seats in the front. So
10 inches.
10 inches. I had the very good fortune to be hired into an archive that was established almost 100 years ago. And I feel very lucky to be part of that. It's the Labadie Collection at the University of Michigan Library. It was started by Joseph A. Labadie, who was an anarchist and a labor organizer, originally from a small town in the backwoods of Michigan, in Paw Paw, Michigan, which was hundreds of miles from any big city. And he was not from a wealthy family. He was from a very poor family. He didn't have any formal education. He knew English, French from his family, but he also learned Potawatomi from the remnants of the Native American tribes that lived near there. And his family became friends with the Native tribes. And when he was about 14, being the head of his family, and his father was had taken off, so he was the oldest child, he had to learn a trade. And the trade that he decided to take up was printing. And at that time, around 1865 or so, the printing trade was one of the few trades that was unionized. I think there were 3 or 4 cigar makers, shoemakers, printers. In order to get work, they had to join a union. So he went on the road as a tramp printer, what they called. And everywhere he went, he had to join the union and had a union card given to him. And then he could work in a print shop. And the print shops at that time, they were skilled workers, and not everybody could read and write who worked there. But they would designate one person to read the daily papers to the rest of the workers as they worked. And that's how they got their news, and they got radicalized that way. And that's how Joe Labadie got radicalized. So he became an anarchist in about 1870, and also worked as an organizer for a labor federation called the Knights of Labor. It was a federation that was working to organize unskilled workers, black workers, women workers, and so they were rather subversive at that time, sort of a precursor to the IWW. So he went all over the country organizing for the Knights of Labor. and made friends all over and started his own printing press and began to, because he learned to read and write by that time, started writing his own newspaper columns and publishing his own papers. He had a syndicated newspaper column called Cranky Notions that labor papers and socialist and anarchist papers all over the country would publish. And he, because he had his printing press, he printed up little pamphlets with his essays and poetry, and he printed up other essays from his friends, and he started collecting everybody's writings and collecting correspondence and saving it. And so by 1911, he had amassed a huge amount of literature in his house, and his wife was tired of trying to get around it, so she said, "You got to get rid of this stuff." So he donated it to the University of Michigan Library. There were other libraries in the country that wanted this literature. University of Michigan was not one of them, but he wanted it to be close to him physically, geographically, so he offered it there, and they took it. They really didn't know what to do with it. They kind of shoved it off in a corner for about 10, 15 years, and although people were allowed to use it, there was nobody really in charge of it. It wasn't a huge amount of material compared to what we have today. It was probably about 20 boxes of stuff, but there it was, the Labadie Collection. Around 1923 or so, a woman by the name of Agnes Inglis came to the library. She knew about the Labadie Collection, and she knew the Labadie family, and she wanted to do some research on her own. And she saw that the Labadie Collection had not been taken care of, had not been cataloged or organized in any way, and she decided to volunteer her time. She was from a wealthy family. She was an anarchist. She was a friend of Emma Goldman. She was active in the movement. And she thought she would spend about 6 months putting it all together, but she fell in love with the collection, and she spent the rest of her life, which was about 30 years, putting that collection together. But not only organizing what was there, writing to people all over the country, all over the world, who were active in social movements and asking them to send their materials. She would write letters and say, "I'm trying to build this library, this archive, this labor collection, this radical collection. Would you send me whatever you have?" And people did, from all over, in droves. And because of Agnes Inglis's work, the Labadie Collection became the biggest archive of its kind in the country, certainly in the country, and one of the top in the world as well. And Agnes Inglis died in 1952, and for about 10 years the library did not appoint another librarian or archivist or any staff member at all. Inglis had not been trained as a librarian either, but she knew the movements and she knew where to put things, and she had everything in her head, and she was very gracious with her time and helped people who would come and loaned materials and hosted visitors. But they did not appoint another librarian for about another 10 years until about early 60s, and they decided that the Labadie Collection really needed somebody to take care of it. So they appointed Edward Weber, who was working as a librarian in the social sciences section of the library. And he continued collecting materials on social movements for the next 40 years. He retired in 2000. And around 1994, the library finally decided that they needed extra help in the Labadie Collection because it was getting too big, and Ed Weber was probably going to retire someday, so they hired me as the first assistant curator, first trained archivist in the library. And I became full-time assistant curator, collecting materials and arranging and describing materials and doing reference work. And in 2000, Ed Weber retired, and I became the full-time curator. And still, there is no assistant curator since then, but I took over from that point. So that's basically the history in a nutshell. There's been 3 curators in the last almost 100 years of the history of the Labadie Collection. Ian wanted me to talk about what it's like working in a gigantic institution, in a radical archive. And really, I mean, a lot of people have done that, and you know that you can just feel like a cog in the wheel sometimes. And I have a lot of autonomy, though, and so being that cog in the wheel, they really have no idea what I'm doing most of the time. But I am working, and I do enjoy the work. It's very rewarding. I spend a lot of my time doing the paradoxical tasks of protecting individual privacy while providing universal access to our materials. And that's always an issue when you're working with radical archives. I enjoy using state money to purchase materials that explain how to smash the state. I also try to spend a lot of my time cooperating with other archives and libraries and sharing materials and providing access and making sure that nothing gets wasted. And I've done that a lot with the Prelinger archive as well, the library. We share a lot of materials with whatever libraries. I try to focus on the ones that are providing the most access and have the most longevity, because even though working in a big institution, it can be very discouraging. You can feel this bureaucratic institution closing in on you, and sometimes I'd like to secede from them and start an independent library. I know that it wouldn't last very long if I did that. It would not last 100 years. It would not last probably 10 years, because I get a lot of support from the university as a whole and the library in particular. I get a budget to work with and to purchase materials, and I get staff, and I get housing, and I get preservation work, and just a number of types of support that nobody would get on their own. And as Lincoln was saying, it's just impossible to run an archive when you need that kind of help, and you need to consider preserving the materials. I don't know how much more time I have.
Plenty of time later.
So I should stop now? Okay. I just want to say, this past year I've been also working on an exhibit about 1968, because we have a lot of materials from that time period as well. And I just completed it. In fact, the exhibit is being mounted this week while I'm out here. And that's been a lot of fun, because the posters that I've seen in Lincoln's show are very familiar to me, and I've just been totally immersed in 1968. And I guess that's all I have to say now.
Great stuff. Thank you, Julie, very much. Fascinating. Thank you very much. Yes, we'll doubtless come back to that. So, one of the issues that was interesting to us when we were putting this together was really around the question of triage, if you like, rescue archiving. When you have to do things under great pressure, archaeologists know about this. At Berkeley, Leanne Hinton, that some of you, of course, know, has been very involved in the desperate plight of the native languages of this continent. And I was talking to Charles Briggs, the anthropologist, about this, and it was Charles who suggested that we invite Kalim Smith to come and talk about how to think about extinction and loss and erasure, in this case of cultures and languages, with respect to the question of conservation, archive, and so on. So I'm delighted that Kalim is here, and over to you.
All right. Thank you. Permission to speak my native language? I'm kidding. Miyuyam, no natong Kalim Smith yaka. No pahai ola yauk atahi vatanti pi huay yanti iek momium. Pito non tetilak atachum pom telang omom pomik. Non wetrum man patrum atachum pom telat potetila votak. No keep una echla viejas Indian reservation shack. Pi non pito owa akpilachilash pechanga pi chamakilawash potonga ka. Non hu unikat una pi non pilachikat hivi you see Berkeley nga. Well, basically I introduced myself, and to make a long story short, I teach language called Luiseño or Cahuicham, Payom Cahuicham, and I live in Viejas Indian Reservation, but I'm also a student here in Berkeley. Dr. Briggs, Charles Briggs, he's somewhere. I've been working with him since I was at UCSD doing a master's there in ethnic studies. So today a lot of the things I'm going to say, I'm speaking not for all Native Americans or in any way, but speaking for myself and for those elders and community members who've asked me to speak for them, representing the causes among the Kumeyaay people of San Diego County area, the Luiseño, just in Riverside County, and Cocopah of Southern California area, Yuma area. Those are all sort of where I'm from. And the dust was just settling because I come from a nomadic people, and we tend to always have a change of clothes with us. I just got in off the plane, actually. So, yeah, I was teaching about maybe 5 hours ago at a tribal school, which is in bilingual, and I do all teaching in only the native language. And in some circles, it is a known fact that there are indigenous languages. Some people don't even know that California Indians have languages or ever did. And universities such as this one have been supporters of efforts to archive and now revitalize those languages. But what if the very efforts to revitalize the indigenous language actually did not bolster Native American goals of bringing those native tongues of the ancestors into wider community use, but in fact they have the opposite effect? This in fact is possible, and it can be a very dangerous situation, a recolonization of Native American languages via well-meaning friends of the Indian. So Leanne Hinton said in her Green Book of Language Revitalization, which is a pretty nice tool, that a language that is not the language of government, nor a language of education, nor a language of commerce or of wider communication is a language whose very existence is threatened in the modern world. We kind of have a different view of the modern world, however, and we don't necessarily see it as such. We could go into that, but it would take a while. It'd be very interesting, though. So what's at stake here? Well, as we know, there are great archives right now of Native American elicitations and whatnot that have been recorded since, Boaz and before him. And what's at stake for Native peoples is the power for them to conceptualize in their own ways and relate to the world and to their creator, basically an identity formation, which is very central to our being. So from plots to religiously convert Native Americans to lyrics in Disney movies such as Peter Pan, indigenous languages have been stereotyped and as uncivilized, unrefined, and unimportant. Part of this journey of the eradication of Native freedom of speech has been in boarding schools, whose goal were to kill the Indian and save the man. And in those boarding schools, there had been estimated around 50,000 Native American children died before leaving those schools. not exactly a happy first educational experience for many families. Up until this day, the stories are remembered as people still have grandparents who went through these things. It's not so far off. We only became citizens in 1924 of this country, that is. So in my experience, we're finding our own freedom of speech, our freedom to speak our own languages. And we tending to use decolonizing methodologies. There was a writer, Linda Tuhiwai Smith, who's a language activist. She started the language nest in New Zealand with the Maori people, or many may know as Maori. And basically what we do is instead of looking at the language from an institution and saying, okay, how can we help you guys? We say, how can this community reach out to people that may be useful, and how can they work with us? So the only reason why I'm here in the first place is because community members, actually spiritual leaders, two of them in particular, asked me to continue my studies because I was ready to just stay home and do what I was doing, which was just working in the community. So today and I work at a bilingual school, which we can go into details if anybody has questions later. But today we're creating our own archives, much of which is based on and comprised of, repatriations and reacquisitions of different things. But what's most important is not just these materials, but what's most important about these archives are to know which archives are being preserved, and how do archivists, linguists, anthropologists, etc., conceptualize those whose materials that are being archived. So how did that list get made up? When I taught a language class in a different language other than I just spoke to you, when I taught in the Kumeyaay language, we had a grammar book that sounded nothing like a Kumeyaay would speak. So what do we do with that? The elders started laughing when I was reading through it. So then we have to say, okay, we have these archives, but maybe we need to reframe and relook at how these things were created in the first place, what points of authority were there, and how can we actively pursue creating our own for our own people. And I don't know how we are in time. I have no idea right now. So I will end with that.
Gosh. I felt the spirit of Mario Savio as you were speaking, and the people who I often wonder who they were lived along the side of the creek here so recently. We live at a place at a time which is dedicated more or less to the assassination of memory, and it was moving to hear that. Not least that cunning introduction in which those of us who do not speak Khmer, all we heard, of course, was Indian Reservation and UC Berkeley. All right, Kalim, yes. More later. So, over without more ado to Megan and Rick for the wind-up of the first round.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. I want to start by thanking Julie for the donations to our library. We are the Prelinger Library, an independent experimental research library in San Francisco. We do collect radical literature and we're open to the public, but we're not institutionalized. We're interested in libraries as kind of ecologies of books and at looking at how books and documents and the assassinated histories and the evidence of the assassinated histories flow through institutions and both private and publicly accessible collections. We ourselves are independent writers and historians, and this to create a library and open it to the public has been for us something of an outside agitation into that ecology of books. And so we wanted to talk today about where our collection comes from and where it goes. And part of that, we have some duplicates and triplicates from our left, anarchist, and progressive and literature, and we wanted to bring them along to share and to offer people who are curators, librarians, archivists at collections that are open to the public, if anyone would like any, to take them, because we're kind of interested in this idea of what's the life of the artifact as it flows through history, and it's created, it's published, it's copyrighted. And today in the digital world, those of us who are a few generations down the line looking at redistribution, it's interesting for us to note as we watch kind of the flow of the literature go into private collections or publicly accessible archives and libraries. The next stage for many of us, as Lincoln was saying, is to do digitization and to kind of introduce the digital sphere as a new player between occupying its own intermediate zone between public and private collection resources, but a lot of radical literature is copyright or it's too fragile to be digitized. And so that's, and many of the things that we brought today here to share are, and also those that are in publicly accessible libraries, I wanted to say, are they're in libraries that are open to the public insofar as the public has access to academic institutions. And there's something of a geographic and therefore cultural dislocation between the producers of the literature, maybe the people doing community work, people doing up to the minute, up to the day activism and organization, who are not active in academic libraries and materials not in public libraries. And so we brought literature that we noticed was mostly not digitized and not digitizable, and also mostly not held in public libraries, or at least not libraries that are open to the general public without any access restrictions whatsoever. And interestingly, so we get a lot of our material from other library discards, libraries who are familiar with our mission and are very kind to us and send us things like Julie. And we just this week we're processing about 8 cartons of books from the Free Library of Philadelphia, and right in the box popped up a critical bibliography of the events of May, June '68. Anyway, yeah. Which I looked it up in WorldCat and is held only at Berkeley and Stanford in the Bay Area. So this artifact speaks to the problem, and we want to offer it to Shannon if she wants it. And hopefully, as artifacts kind of proposed to people, everybody, and all librarians and archivists, to think about the system of the transmission of books through institutions as a type of ecology and a distribution system, and to take an artifact and think about its what's its lifespan and who's it going to end up with, and what kind of new meaning and life are they going to be able to make with it. And it would be interesting, I mean, Ian invited a provocation, so I guess it would be interesting to disseminate some artifacts and invite people to put them in their collections and take notes on what happens to them and user profiles, and we could track where we got it from and make a project or something. So like book crossing, right, only different. And we have a few WPA guides and a few modern age books just here on the table. And with that, I'll turn it over to Rick. And invite, also we brought some brochures if anyone wants to pick some up. To Rick, partner in the library.
So 10 inches away, it's nice to see so many strange faces here tonight. So I'm going to not talk about the library so much. I'm going to speak as an archivist. I've been thinking a lot lately about how archives function within communities and within societies in general. And the archives are quiet places, but they're also battlegrounds right now. A lot of sort of differences, contests, and struggles are filtering into the archive, and that's really what I want to talk about. Most people in the real world don't think much about archives unless they're genealogists or detectives or maybe seekers of justice. And in fact, archives have become kind of a special interest, which is wrong. People resist evidence. Historical documents are often loaded, incendiary. They trace histories that are complicated, unpleasant, violent. People sometimes hide and destroy evidence, but they also try to wrap history in scarcity. Like almost everything else, there's this sense that it's valuable, that they can make money from it. Could we think about different ways of collecting in different kinds of archives? I would hope so. And in fact, what we're hearing from these good people is that there is this kind of thinking going on, but it is not widespread enough. So like a couple questions. Why are archives important? Historical evidence is fragile. Much vanishes every day. But so what? We are reverent about archives. It's a vague reverence. It's not reality-based. People actually expect archives to be around when they need them. We say archives are doing really important work in the way that we might praise, an oil spill responder or a garbage collector or the cop who arrests the driver that hit the cyclist, But classically, archives belong to to larger organizations, to governments, to churches, to universities, to corporations, to wealthy families. They're not usually public institutions. Like a lot of children, they were conceived to fulfill their parents' agendas. They make their own rules. Most of the time, they can choose how open they want to be, and they can lay down conditions for access to their materials. And so in a way, archives become gatekeepers. At worst, they exercise control over historical materials, and they can arbitrate people's connections with their own history. They can let certain histories through. They can block others. So in a sense, archives aren't always institutions of memory, right? They can be institutions of denial as well, and they've done this time and time again. So all of this implies that there's a separation between people and documents and between society and its memory, but it doesn't have to be that way. As we've heard, in the same way that we've heard tonight, there's a really, really active discourse around archives and social justice, especially in emerging societies. There's really important work that's being done in South Africa and Asia and Eastern Europe and elsewhere. How can archives help people situate themselves within historical process? And how can the work of archivists be integrated into the making of history rather than standing outside it? So we've got this amazing infrastructure of archives, public, private, personal. I would say ecology, as Megan said, of not just of libraries but archives. But that doesn't guarantee, just because they're there, that we can see or hear or touch what we need to now or in the future. U.S. public libraries have an ethic of access and a tradition of openness, but that's not really true in the archival world. And we're starting to see, as Lincoln mentioned, that there's this cultural collections, many of them are starting to lock down because there's this exaggerated idea that they're valuable. But it takes a super, super special case to turn an archives into a money machine. And quite often it might be cheaper to give away digital copies than it is to build a business to exploit them. So we're in this funny position where if archives don't open up, and if they don't start thinking and acting like cultural producers, and if they don't push their holdings out. And I'm thinking, I'm a media archivist. I call myself a recovered media archivist, but it's impossible to quit collecting, so I'm a media archivist. But and this is a real problem when it comes to film, moving image, video. It's going to be a problem when it comes to games. If we don't push stuff out for people, our future is nowhere. We're going to be obsolete because younger people, who are the majority of media makers, have already given up on legacy archives. They don't go to the Library of Congress. They don't go to state historical societies. They've rooted around us. They rip stuff. They go to YouTube. They'll go to peer-to-peer sites, regardless of whoever thinks that they own that material. And YouTube is, one of the most interesting kind of case studies of our time, because a powerful company stepped in and built something great, but it's something that at the same time reduced other people's ability to move in the same direction, and the legacy archives are never really going to be able to catch up. So, like, what's positive here? I would say two things. I think that archival practice needs to look to, I think we need to look to ourselves. And I think archival practice needs to think about amateurism and do-it-yourself activity, so that's unofficial rather than credentialed necessarily. There's a big upsurge of that. It relates in a way to old school punk culture, this notion that you take what's around you, availabilism, as Craig Baldwin calls it. You pick up the tools around you and you do it. And it's similar to what people are doing in citizen science and urban agriculture and in maker culture. So we have a wide open field for experimentation. So in Berkeley, I never know really whether to be a centralist or a decentralist. But the archival thing is interesting because the future of archives has a lot to do with decentralization, and the exciting stuff that's going on in the archival world is based on regions, it's based on communities, it's based on shared cultures and interests. These are ideas that these are projects that aren't like hatched at the Library of Congress. It's things like in Chicago, the South Side Home Movie Project, which attempts to recover local memory and local history, play it back in that community, and that is the origin point, and that's the point where things are shown and seen, and as a result, it's very, very direct, and then you put it online and anybody could have access to it, but it's rooted in a specific place. I'd finish by saying, there's a bit of traditionalism that we might think about. So just because we live in an age when mass distribution is a possibility with the internet, it doesn't mean we all have to make mass media. The rewards from working in specific communities often outweigh the benefits of mass distribution. And finally, a lot of traditional practices about saving history and memory and pushing it back out into the world are really well suited to individuals and small groups, and many of them are answers to the question, what can I do? Many of you have heard me say this before, but in culture, there's room for all sorts of experiments that you might not yet be able to make in society and in the economic system, and by trying things out in the sphere of culture, can make some very, very powerful tests, powerful experiments, and also make some strong points to people about ways things could be different. Thanks.
Well, a terrific start, and we thank the videographer and the recordists, because a transcript of this first hour will be itself a remarkable document, it seems to me, but we're only just beginning. A footnote before we open it up to what Rick was saying. I forgot to bring a short paragraph that was written for this occasion because he couldn't be here tonight, by Robert Proctor, the historian of tobacco, wanting to make a point that was congruent with what Rick has just said, which is that, of course, most of the archives we work with, these are documents of barbarism, and we stand on ground not of our own choosing, but combing the archives, the mainstream, the establishment archives, in new ways, is producing electrifying results for Robert. Robert Proctor works in the tobacco archives at UCSF. These are industry archives. 50 million pages, extremely unwieldy. However, by using optical recognition technology and punching in keywords, he is getting extraordinary results very quickly. And he believes that a kind of a revolution in that sense in doing, for those who are doing history from below, is upon us just by this new sort of unexpected technology which we can turn upon our masters. So Robert apologized he couldn't be here to tell us a little bit about that, but we're hoping that he will write about this for the volume that we are planning to come out of the work of which this evening is just the beginning. So before we open it up for the dialogics, I would just like to thank, I forgot to do this, James Jacobs at Stanford and Xin Jung, who can't be here, for their initial conversations, which out of which came the invitation that to bring Julie, and we're delighted that you were able to come. And also, I hope that Shannon Shepherd is in the room. Is Shannon? Yes. And I spoke to Shannon, who is the librarian at the Holt Labor Library in San Francisco, and asked Shannon if she would maybe say a few words about archiving from specifically from the point of view of labor.
Thank you.
There is a roving microphone, I think, because we're trying to get this recorded. No, I mean, we're talking about for, you know, for the, well, there should be several.
Should be an R.
Hmm? Okay. Okay. Do you want to come? Do you want to come to the? Here's there we are, Shannon. We've got.
What do you
No, let's
Throw a microphone.
give me the microphone?
Don't take that one. We've got a couple of these things because we wanted a radical dialogics.
My name is Shannon Shepherd. I'm the director of the Holt Labor Library in San Francisco. It's a privately funded, open to the public library that library and archives that collects labor and radical history. And most of our collection comes from those amateur collectors out there who, from the 30s, the 40s, 50s even, and especially the 60s, and on to the present time. Most of the collection is donated. I think the strengths of our collection, I mean, number one, it's putting this material all in one place so that when someone is researching, there's just, you know, one place they don't have to go from, you know, one section of a library to, you know, the other section down, you know, the stairs or into a different building to an archive. So we wanted to do that when it was established. That was one of the reasons to bring this collection together. And also to preserve this material, which we all want to do, and to make it accessible. And I think the point that was brought up here by, you know, with a lot of these collections being in major research institutions, for people who, you know, may not have a college education or may not have graduated from high school, it's pretty intimidating to come on a university campus and try and navigate your way to a library, and especially when there's multiple libraries on a university campus, and even knowing the difference between a library and an archive and the kinds of collections. So we've tried to make it accessible and friendly, user-friendly. Of course, the big problem being independently funded, it's funded by primarily one individual, Rod Holt, who was one of those people who was in the right place at the right time. He's an engineer by trade. He was radicalized during the Cuban Revolution and the Civil Rights Movement in this country, and somehow found his way to the Bay Area and hooked up with Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, and became a multimillionaire overnight. And apparently when you do that, you have to set up nonprofits. And he, being an activist in the radical movement for many years, he looked around and saw that a lot of the activists, the labor and radical activists, who were often one and the same from the 30s, were downsizing, and in many cases were dying, and their children maybe weren't interested or didn't have the space. And so he went around to a lot of the people that he knew, and that's how the initial collection began. Major problem with these kinds of collections is funding. When you have one person and you know, that's just not enough. It starts out being enough, but then as the collections grow, you begin to run out of space. You become more known, and so you have more people calling you for reference questions, more people coming in, and how do you accommodate everyone? In addition, you know, the materials that we have are materials that we want to make available, as we all do, I think, to as many people as possible. but there's funding that's involved with even digitizing them. So I'll leave it at that. We collect personal papers of individual radicals. We have a lot of Fair Play for Cuba materials in our personal archives. We collect buttons and posters. Lincoln, photographed many of our posters. Pamphlets, leaflets, and we continue to collect today. The other question I'd like to raise is the electronic method of disseminating flyers, leaflets these days. Who's collecting them? How do we go about collecting them? And I'm doing it the old-fashioned way. I'm printing them out. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So the idea now is to open it up, and to say it's not a question of questions or comments, but a kind of a dialogue. And they, again, it's not that questions have to come or comments have to come through me or be directed necessarily to the panel. It can go horizontally. Before we begin, would any of you feel really pressing that you have to respond horizontally to anything that was said there? Can we go? Okay. Yeah, who would like to? Let's go here. Yeah.
Where are we going?
I hope so. My question is for all the smaller institutions, or not institutions, but archive, who's your audience? Who is and do you envision is going to continue to use your collections? And that's primarily Shannon and I don't know, I guess Rick, Prelinger and Megan, who are not affiliated with large research institutions or libraries. So who are the people who need to use your archive, and who are your audience?
I can start. We've been open for just 4 years, and we our library was an experiment in many ways, not the least in which that we did not know what was going to happen when it opened. But we've had over 1,000 visitors per year for over 3 years, and we're only, because we work to support it, we're not institutionally funded. We're only open 1 to 2 days a week, so that's really kind of something. And our visitor profile it skews young, which is fascinating. Again, not what we expected. We thought, put all of our books in a room and tell everyone we know that they can come and study there, and what will happen, we'll get to spend more time with people who we already know. But that's, that wasn't, instead, 1,000 20-somethings a year come in doing projects of all kinds, collecting images for media, doing media research, people who have little distinction or need for distinctions between, in a way, still image, moving image, and print resources. They kind of can pull it all and mash it all up and make something new out of it. We do position ourselves as a workshop and provide tables, scanners, invite cameras, all that jazz. So people do come and just pull material. And we have young media makers, but also artists, and then the 28s and ups who are nonfiction writers, independent scholars, and novelists doing historical research. That's our profile summary.
Could I just say that we find that the utopianism section gets a lot more action than the so-called old left or the labor history section. We would like that to be different, but that hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, but sometimes people come and a lot of the people who sit in the labor history section just read there and don't bring material out to rework it in any way, but they just sit right there and read in the aisles, and then they come out and do something different. So it's not that it doesn't get used, but it's not being used in the same way as some of the other parts of the collection.
Is there anyone else who's got something to say on this thread? Use, audience? Shannon, yeah?
Yeah, we are the people who use our library. I mean, it varies. Is this on? It varies. The people who set this on. The people who use the library varies, but we get a lot of young radicals today who are, looking to the past to see what we did back then. The hands-off Venezuela, when that committee was first established a couple of years ago, came in because they heard we had some of the Fair Play for Cuba materials, and they wanted to see what Fair Play for Cuba did back in the 60s. We also, and you probably have too, we've had theater groups come in. When there was a play called Sacco and Vanzetti, and they came in to use some of our materials and photograph it and blow it up for a lobby display. There was also a play on the Greensboro Massacre. The Communist Workers' Party, 5 members and supporters were murdered by the Ku Klux Klan at a demonstration in Greensboro. And there was a play written about that, and they came in and actually photographed some of the materials and blew it up and used it for stage sets. But we do get a lot of radicals coming in now at labor and social activists.
Thank you, Shannon. Anything else still on this thread? Okay, right at the back then, and then Liz?
Is it working? Yeah, if anybody probably needed to be here, it was myself. I'm among the activist community. I'm pretty well known as a video addict, actually a video activist. But I started videoing in activist demonstrations, all kinds of events, speakers, in the mid '80s, and with 8mm and Super VHS, and then I switched to High 8. But I've got about over 1,500 hours in the last 20-some years of in the streets, all kinds of things, you name it. And even Chiapas, I was down there and I did a whole bunch of film in Chiapas. But it's all raw footage, and I've had about 7 or 8 VCRs, and what I did was make copies for everybody and just pass them out. I wasn't in it for the money, just to educate people. And I've got all this footage, and actually I've got to move in 2 months, and I've never found anybody that I'm just not very good technically. I've never found anybody to help me edit it, and not that I'm incapable myself, but I never found the time to edit it. And so I'm glad I found you. If anybody's interested, for 5 years I had a program right here in Berkeley called "So How'd You Become an Activist?" And people came in and talked about their experiences and influence that helped them become positive forces for change. And I videoed all that. It was 50 programs: Daniel Ellsberg, Michael Parenti, Utah Phillips, all these different people. And I've got all this footage. What do I do with it? I'm moving, and I'd like to donate it somewhere. So please feel.
Everybody I know, it turns out, oh, I've got some stuff. What do I do with it? And at least you're alive. Right? I mean, the worst case is all of a sudden there's, somebody calls up and says, gee, my, wife, roommate, whatever left, a bunch of boxes. Do you want it? And it's incredibly hard to go through that kind of stuff. I mean, the fact is you've got something, you know what it is, you can describe it. You can sort of come up with sort of a description of the collection. You can describe physically how big it is, sort of what date range it is, what subjects it includes. And we can, there are listservs of progressive archivists, of institutions. We can help place that. I do a lot of this where people say, I got this stuff, what do I do with it? And there's no one great answer. There's a range of options, but if you can sort of describe it and pass it along to any of us, we'll circulate. I mean, there is the first step is just spreading the word among who's interested in this stuff. I mean, what you're describing is of intermediate attraction. You know, it's raw footage, it's going to require a huge amount of processing, but it's also got some real gems in it. So the more you can describe that, the more attractive that's going to be to an institution or even to an individual who's working on similar stuff.
I heard radical activism. It's all radical activism.
Absolutely. Well,
Thank
I mean,
you very much. In
yeah.
the front here. Lincoln. Yeah.
Yeah, this is on a different thread here. Your name, Rick? Is that what you said? Yeah, you talked about the issues about political issues around people kind of trying to control access and prevent access. There's one example that I read about, and maybe I'm sure you'd probably know. I'm almost sure you'll know about it, but I can't remember the names of the people involved. But it seems like a very important example, and that's when some right-wing author, I believe he was writing either about Alger Hiss or about the Rosenbergs, got his publisher to pay the KGB, or what was left of the KGB, a large amount of money to give them totally exclusive access to the archives, and so that they had the only access, and then I believe the person this author, I think, then was appointed to the National Archives or something after he did this. Do you know that story?
Yeah, I don't know very much about that story, no. I think there's probably people here who do.
But it does remind one of the old Soviet era joke. That's the problem with the past. It's so hard to predict. Okay, on you. Okay, on.
As a public librarian, I am concerned about how people discover these. Melissa Riley in San Francisco Public.
Hi, Melissa.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, Melissa.
How people discover, and especially how librarians can help people discover the libraries and archives that you have, and how we can build better resources to make your stuff more accessible in a variety of ways.
We need to be better networked with each other, and we're working on it. It comes slowly, and build a network and make the network more visible than any of us can be by ourselves. We're working on it.
Chris Carlson.
Yeah,
Okay.
This is Chris Carlson. I've been doing Shaping San Francisco for about 15 years. I don't know why this thing's not really on. There it is. And I just have a couple of sort of interesting kind of problems that I'm facing again for the 93rd time. Many of you have helped. Rick and Megan have been super generous. Melissa Riley at the Public Library. Other people here have been helpful. And I have a kind of I'm a total scofflaw when it comes to copyright. Like, I feel like these things are our shared heritage. So Shaping San Francisco right now is being converted to a wiki because, talking about pushing things back out into the world. We got stuck in a legacy software cul-de-sac back in 2001. We put it up as an intermediate version in 2005. Now we're coming out as a wiki later this fall. We're actually making an agreement with a new museum in the Mint who's going to put their name on it, which will help get a lot more people paying attention to it, which I'm all for. And I'm interested in sort of just presenting the problem, which is that I got tons of material in this project, right? Thousands of images, over about 1,700 screens of different content. And I've taken liberally from tons of books, photographs that I've found, texts that I think are interesting, that are part of the shared history of San Francisco. And I feel like that's our right. We should be able to do that. It shouldn't really be a problem. But as archivists, I know I've run into this from time to time with different archivists. Is there a real nervousness about that I don't have all the pieces of paper signed giving me permission and releases. So I developed a personal ethics about this. Is I don't want to step on any living artist or photographer or writer who is trying to make a living from their work. Of course, I'm not in any way infringing on their ability to make money from their work. But if there's a living person who I can check with, I try to do that. That's my ethic. But it has absolutely nothing to do with the law. I just completely forget the law. And if I wanted to be a lawyer, I'd go be a lawyer. But if I want to do multimedia or, have a living archive of the city that everybody can contribute to, it's a whole other idea. And I think I want to create that space. I want to really sort of like push the edges here and insist that we have a kind of a public duty to violate the law around copyright and actually make these things public and make them accessible.
Yeah, because they can't sue us all.
I know in my situation, there's, I really promote fair use, and a lot of people aren't even aware that there actually is a, provision of the U.S. copyright law that, under certain circumstances, legitimately allows them to sort of push those boundaries. But with even beyond that, movements have always said, you can use our stuff for good stuff, and if you're a capitalist pig, you can't use it. Well, and I actually have some wonderful examples online from books from the 60s and 70s, sort of describing in so many words, here's their version of copyright. Well, I think that we set our own standards here, and again, I think that you've developed an internal ethic of you're not trying to rip anybody off, but at the same time, you feel that the public has a right to know. And so I think that archivists are sometimes sort of stuck in the middle here, where we want to promote this, we want to promote public access. At the same time, it's sort of like a journalist that gives away his sources. If we start throwing everything out, we can start having people say, well, I'm sorry, I'm not going to give you my stuff because, I don't want this to be made, totally public. And so how do you deal with that? There are technical ways of limiting access. So, for example, if you go to a website and you just jump through some hoops saying, yeah, I promise not to do this, at least you're showing some evidence that you're letting people know that this is protected, and if you want to look at it or use it in a classroom, that's one thing. If you want to make a book or a T-shirt, that's another. So again, as archivists become publishers by having their catalogs online and bigger images and more content, all of a sudden you're crossing that boundary where you're not just saying you can walk in and you can look at it, but you're starting to promote it in a way that you're making it as accessible as possible, and you're starting to step on some toes. It's a real gray area, and there's a lot of room for discussion on this. There's no perfect answer.
So my question, first of all, I make documentary films, and I want to thank everyone who works in archives, because I guess I didn't realize this, but I guess I'm a power user of archives. Film archives, print archives. I have this thing that I'm kind of obsessed with every time I go to an archive and I read, say, a writer's papers, is that it's sort of to follow up on what Shannon says, those papers aren't going to exist in the future. They're going to be emails, and either maybe really famous writers will print their email out. I don't think in 10 years some of the email that people have been creating now will even be accessible because the software changes. And I guess I was just curious about how people in radical archives are dealing with this changing technology, and the fact that paper is more archival than many digital types of media, and it's also fragile, but we have paper from 150 years ago. I don't think we're going to have digital, email things from 50 years or even, 20 years into the future. Thank you.
Do anyone want to jump in on that? That's a question. If not, Charles.
Hello, I've got a couple of questions. One specifically for Kalim. It seems from the discussion as if all archives are always good. For Native American languages, often archives were a death sentence. The idea was that the language was dying, so you archived it to preserve the language, because essentially you were presuming that the people and their culture and language would no longer be in existence. How have you been able to, in some of your own efforts, to create archives that have exactly the opposite message with respect to Native American languages? And that one is for everybody. This seems like a really strange sort of point to be thinking about free speech. After all, right now, there are some ways in which the very tenets of free speech have been explicitly undermined in American society. I don't mean implicitly. We know that that's been going around for a long time. But through legislation and through the way in which the news coverage has now ratified the idea that Americans, U.S. citizens, somehow believe that freedom of speech should be restricted, and that it's absolutely natural that anybody whose speech might sort of get the T label attached to it, in some sense, should be criminalized. So what does that mean for archiving, right, those very efforts to create free speech at the historical moment when many of those freedoms are undermined?
Okay, to answer question A. It's true. During the early 1900s, the Bureau of American Ethnology, and was it John Collier? They basically Boaz was employed to do the salvage salvage type of anthropology, where basically any tribe that was of any use was basically only of use as far as they could record whatever they knew about their language, and then after that, you walk away and the tribe was basically going to be, which the whole vanishing Indian, right? They're going to vanish away or assimilate or, become homogenized in one way. And basically the only thing of interest was their language. So once that was captured by either Kroeber or, one of these other people, that was that. And that just, and so now we're archiving our own stuff, and that's something I didn't really get that much into. And we've had many dialogues about digital archives, and we've created in some reservations in my area, there are archives being created and that have been created, and we've had to deal with all of these issues of climate controlling our own stuff, and then what stuff gets put into these archives, what's okay to put in there and what's not. And then nobody mentioned NAGPRA, but that's also a problem for some archivists or archaeologists, which is Native American Graves and Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, right? So what stuff are archivists willing to let go of, especially when it's human remains, usually not taken under the best auspices. Even Geronimo himself, as many of you know, that skull and whatever it is at Yale, that's their biggest bragging point, right, is that they got Geronimo's skull. And that's George Bush's grandfather. So anyway, not to get sidetracked, but we're basically taking the idea of, okay, so people have told us what our language is, what the important things or artifacts of our cultures are, and then we're saying, well, how did you guys come up with that? Or how did you even conceptualize language when you created this list of words and whatnot? Just as Leanne Hinton's statement that I mentioned earlier, there was nothing revolving around the spirituality of the people. And today that's exactly where most all of the language action is happening. Yes, I teach in a school, but it's outside of that school also, in the traditional settings, that religious settings is where part of our greatest archive is, and that's through our songs. I'm a singer, so out of the one cycle of songs alone has 365 songs that have to be sung sequentially from front to back, and that can be repeated from back to front. Now, that is an archive, right? And it's not even, none of that is in anyone's digital archive. It's all in the archives of the singers, and it's mostly taken up by the young people, which is very interesting. And so that's how these archives are now part of this new survival or reinvigoration and sort of this detachment from those old ways of thinking that made us part of that dying, vanishing Indian. So.
Yes, please. And then David next.
No.
I think it was Julie who mentioned twin problems of preserving privacy and maintaining wide open access. And I was just wondering how any of you see that changing, and how users' privacy or rights to access will be protected with increasing digitization of materials.
Well, first, I think it's going to be a really long time, if ever, that everything is digitized, because there's so much. And and the technology is rapidly changing, but not enough to cover some of the materials that would be in question in terms of keeping people's privacy, the archival materials, the correspondence, and the individual documents. my library is one of 10 or so now that has entered this agreement with Google to digitize all the books in the library system. And that sounds like a lot, but there are a lot of exceptions to what they actually can't do. They developed some kind of secret but very fast way of digitizing a book. But the book has to be a certain size and shape. And it can be one of these books, but it can't be a pamphlet. It can't be a soft cover. It has to have a 1/2-inch binding. It has to be within a certain size in length, and it, there's all these exceptions. And how many does that leave out? That leaves out many thousands. Just within my collection alone, the Labadie Collection, we're digitizing all those books, but they're skipping a lot. Now, that doesn't even include the other formats of material, the posters, the flyers, the leaflets, the buttons, and the archival collections. So I don't know if we should even really worry about that, protecting the privacy of those kinds of collections, because then there's also copyright issues involved. And they can digitize a book like this, but they can't put it online. So they're digitizing all of these books, without any restrictions on the copyright date, but that doesn't mean that you're going to be able to see them online. That just means that there's going to be a digital file somewhere, and maybe someday it'll be available. And if it's within the public domain, then it's available now, and if it's not, who knows?
Maybe not in China.
And not in China, right?
So we've got David first before Adam, and then John. Okay, sorry. But before that, maybe Rick could riff a little bit on Google and what their plans are for a minute.
Oh, there's people in the room that probably know a lot more about that than I do. But Google is scanning a tremendous number of books and now of course they're scanning microfilm of most major historical papers, because Google makes money off your search queries, because they can, among other things, sell advertising that has a relationship to the topic you're interested in. And no matter if it was the nicest people in the world, we should all look very critically at any single organization that tries to collect a lot of information in one place. That's just an issue that's inherently really, really complicated. And maybe next year we can talk about Google.
Thank you. David Kubrin, then Adam, and then John Gillis, and then Lisa.
Yeah, as a historian, I could fly over to some obscure abbey in England and ask to see their rent records from 930. And with some luck, those historical documents exist, and I could pore over them. And I'm worried not so much, in addition to the existence of emails that don't have a documentary form, I'm worried about governmental records and business records and all sorts of records that exist in a digital form that to some degree will be accessible, but as the software changes and as the computers change and all that, some of those documents will be reproduced, copied, put in the new format, but a lot won't be. The sheer constraints of money and time are going to mean that a whole lot of records will disappear because of the rush to digitalize. And that really concerns me, because these records are the stuff of history. So in the larger sphere of all kinds of history, not just left, labor, anarchist documents, although those too, I'm worried about the digital disappearance of information.
Another example. Right after September 11th, I happened to be doing a survey of union websites. And some of the union websites had incredibly racist stuff about September 11th, about, let's get these Arabs. And those sites were down 2-3 days later. So the ephemerality of modern digital media is beyond question. I mean, there's different versions of the San Francisco Chronicle when it comes out. Well, they do different editions for different locations. They do different editions over time of that day. I mean, there are multiple versions of almost anything you can think of. The question is, as an archivist, do you do you try to capture them all? Is somebody really going to care? Do you have room for that? I mean, decisions have to be made about how do you capture what. But sometimes there's a political decision. You say, oh, this is really important. I need to take a snapshot now. This is an important moment to capture, and you could well be the only person doing that. I mean, you know, there are web archiving projects of various forms, you know, but nobody's going to capture everything that's being created digitally. And so there's going to be tons of stuff just disappearing into the ether. But some things which you can make a case culturally or politically should be captured. There's that's sort of the equivalent of a proactive, you know, investigative journalist / archivist. I mean, you've got to think this stuff out and try to jump on it before it's too late, because these things will be disappearing even with the best of intentions.
Okay, Rick, can I just make one quick comment? I mean, I have a real problem with this idea, actually, because on the one hand, we hear about, you know, the disaster for history when material doesn't get collected. But on the other hand, you know, we listen to archivists who, you know, sound sometimes like incredibly disentitled people because they can't deal with, they don't have the money, the resources, the consensus, the support to deal with all the material that they already have. And, you know, I think this is kind of like the earthquake. When we get an earthquake, there's not going to be anybody there to rescue you. And you can't rely on official repositories necessarily to save material. If material is important to you or your community, I think you have to take that task into your own hands. Then maybe later on a copy of it finds its way into a more established or official repository. But I think, you know, you guys have the idea. It's control destiny. And I'd also like to say, and this is really contrarian, shoot me down if you like, but my thing is, although I would never stand for the intentional destruction of records, that's often tied in with oppression and destruction of societies and communities, history is about desire for what we don't know, what we can't find, what's lost. And so much of the history that's come out in the last few years and been foregrounded has been history that's been suppressed and pushed under the rug, and it's precisely about this desire to get it back. And so in a sense, there's something very formative when a historical record is incomplete. You know, if everything was saved, it would be like paralytic. It's like a Philip K. Dick world, you know, where everything you ever did is played back. And ultimately, that's kind of oppressive. So I don't know if we want like the Borges world where there's a one-to-one correspondence between the archive and between real life. Technically, that's possible now. But like, you know, anyway. Thank you. Rant over.
Adam, and then John, and then James.
I'm Adam, and I wanted to try to push Kalim's point a little bit further and into the to be addressed by people running the more traditional kinds of archives, because it's not just native people or colonized people who are in danger of extinction, but it's also ideas. And I think the most important part of these archives of resistance, probably the reason that you're running them, is that people do something with them. So I just had a question to ask about the use, because you can walk into an archive, and it's, since you mentioned Borges, it reminds me of the Library of Babel. You walk in, and you know, if you haven't read it, there's a book with every combination of letters somewhere in this library. So you go through the library, and it's mostly gibberish, but sometimes you find something that makes sense to you. And but you know, it's good. It's fun to browse these, but I'm wondering if any of you have thoughts about programs for classes like or reading groups like maybe the Niebel Proctor Library does nearby.
Good question. Got to think on that. Oh, yeah, Lisa, follow on that thread, and then I want to get on that also. Okay. Lisa?
Yeah.
He's on the same point.
Okay. Sure. All right. I just wanted to, in that vein, I wanted to bridge these ideas that Kalim brought up about holding an archive in your body, you know, and in your own mind, and that our stories used to be told by people, you know, and storytellers to pass these things on. And I feel that that's what's so sorely missing and needed in our culture are actual people giving stories to, elders to youth, and I feel like you're holding that place with archives, but yet I feel that more is necessary, something human, and I wonder how we can bring that forth.
Oh, I want to follow up on both of these questions. We've talked a lot about the users of archives, but I'm not sure I heard what you folks say about your responsibility as archivists, in the sense that it seems to me these archives could very easily become kind of open shelves for just about any use. That may be all right. That may be part of freedom. But is part of your responsibility, like elders in a sense, to guide the users to the larger contexts and histories within which these archives are embedded? As a practicing teaching historian, I guess my bias is very clear that we have an awful lot to teach, which is not in any way inhibited by the lack of sources. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about the way you guide the users of your archives in the fruitful ways, as an elder would, in using these archives for the purposes of the left.
I'll start. So part of our experience with having, to us, overwhelming response and interest in our collection on the part of young people, millennial generation, is that opening the library and making it as a public offering became a commensurate activity with teaching, and it's inseparable. And it's only like 1 out of 25 people who walks in and says, "Oh, I don't need to talk to you, I just want to take a look." And then they make a U-turn and go out again. And it's really to varying degrees of the 5 or 10 minute or 20-minute talk about why this project, how these 10,000 forgotten things fit together in a pattern that makes sense and is really important, why to look for labor history in old industry history magazines. It's all of a piece, and we've, over the last 4 years, both of us experienced varying degrees of informality to formality in our roles as teachers, where we've not just with the people who drop in and we talk to them for a half hour or an hour about their projects, but also getting pulled in to do a lot of teaching at local institutions and becoming advisors on specific projects. So it's kind of all of a piece.
Actually, it's James. But before James, you say something, just to bring Lisa and Megan's point together, the millennials and the X, Y, and Z generations, I'm reminded, I ought to say right now that it's the symposium on Saturday in San Francisco that will bring together some of the old 68ers to tell their stories. Do encourage the millennials. What's that? That's 17 to... What is the millennial? This is a demographic I haven't yet heard of.
17 to
anyway, do encourage them to show up at the University of San Francisco for the big symposium on Saturday. Coffee and breakfast at 8:30, and the opening plenary will be at 9:15, and it goes through all day.
It's really early.
We hope they...
If you're talking about millennial.
Kalim's going to speak to the...
I just wanted to say that, like, to me, what this thread here, and probably the whole entire thing, but what it relates to is power. I mean, I think that's basically the underlying concept there of how the archive was even conceptualized, how an archive is conceptualized, what is an archive and where does it lie, right? And then how the categories are defined and it should be, and these things should be talked about, and under what context of relevance was this whole entire thing generated, right? And I think that a lot of times that is not what's talked about. That's exactly what's not, because then you reveal structures of power that could be very, problematic for some people.
Thank you. What's it, James?
I guess this sort of works on that as well. In listening to all the presentations, I'm struck by sort of a cognitive dissonance between the talk about access and contextualization and preservation. And maybe to drive that point home a little bit, my wife, Shin Jung-yo, who helped put this together, we visited a Buddhist library in Korea a few years back called Haeinsa, and it's listed on the UNESCO World Heritage list. It's a library of woodblock prints of 13th century Buddhist scriptures. It's a really beautiful archive and library. However, the Korean government has said that the Buddhist monks cannot use the woodblock prints without, or the woodblocks themselves, without asking for permission from the government. The monks, on the other hand, are saying we need to use the woodblocks. The ink is used to preserve the wood, actually. If the ink is not used, the wood cracks, becomes brittle, and is destroyed. So I wondered if and Kalim, you brought this point up really, really well. I liked that. So maybe you can.
Some NAGPRA issues also.
Yeah.
So, and I just lost my train on that, but it does definitely, it has something to do with that, yeah. Well, yeah.
I'd also like to comment on that. I mean, it is a huge responsibility that we have as archivists. It's daunting to think that I know more about the Labadie Collection than any living person, and I feel like I know nothing. Although more and more every day, I mean, I'm constantly learning more and more what's in there, and but to see the look on a 17 or 18-year-old kid's face when they see an original document, that just, it blows their mind, and it's really rewarding. I've been teaching this class, or helping to teach this class, on the Black Power movements for the last couple of years, and the professor has been bringing the class into the archive to look at some of the original issues of Muhammad Speaks from the early 60s and the mid 60s. And the newspaper is falling apart and with use, and because it's 40 some years old. So now I'm faced with the decision to get a microfilm copy of the newspaper and not let anybody touch the originals, because if we keep doing that, they're just going to be gone forever. And that's very sad to me.
Back, what I was going to mention about that is that it becomes the power to decide who gets, whether or not, say, tribe X gets the remains of their grandparents. Well, it's actually basically up to the museum, is what it's turning out, which is interesting. And then it becomes a big fight, legal battle, and then one case after another, and then the stuff never gets repatriated to the people who want to just give their ancestor a proper burial. And that's happening right now and all the time. Yeah.
We're winding down, but yes, Barbara.
I just wanted to add that I think this concern about the original material relates to land use, and the fact that, as Ian said, we're on ground not of our own choosing. Because I'm thinking of Simone Weil's book, Rootedness, and her proverb, really: those who are uprooted, uproot. Those who are not uprooted, do not uproot. And I'm remembering in William McLish's book, The Day Before America, the Mohawk, the last of his people who knew the full day-long ceremony to keep the peace among the Iroquois Federation. but it had to be performed on a particular place that was being cut up by roads and fences. And William McLish, with him there at the site, said he was told it was like watching the last library burn.
Well, that's a very beautiful poetic coda. Yes, please.
Just yes. You know, I've been around, many archives and archivists, and yeah. Well, one sort of truism I think people often think is, well, certainly my father's archive, who documented Berkeley in the 60s, was a kind of a positivist approach, which is that you collect primary data and all this information, and that will somehow negate, propaganda and or ignorance. And I think what we're seeing now, clearly in the world with more information available than ever before for anybody online, is that this notion, is not necessarily true. Right? In other words, anybody can go online and find stuff that used to be extremely inaccessible. Even the Dead Sea Scrolls apparently will finally be available, and yet you can have Sarah Palin being this incredibly popular figure who basically makes a religion of ignorance, right? I mean, that's so this is sort of an obvious point, but I mean, I think that what I would conclude from it is that what's incredibly important is that all this information be presented in context and in forum like this, and in with some politics behind it, essentially, because we can't simply rely on the truth to set people free. Particularly as we know also that with new media and old media, for that matter, that they can be altered. We've already talked about that a fair bit. So, the documents don't necessarily speak for themselves, and so the process of interpretation, I just want to remind us, is terribly important.
Thank you. Broadside against the cult of information, the idiocy of the cyber libertarians, as if information wants to be free. Information is a notion that is devised by telephone engineers. Of course, we need a radical hermeneutics. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Eddie. And there comes a time when the operation of the cafe becomes so pressing that we have to... Thank you all for coming, and thank especially for Kalim, Lincoln, Julie, Megan, and Rick. Thank you. Thank you, Jill. Thank you very much.